When my wife died, I grew suspicious of my greedy son-in-law. To ease the grief, I took him and my daughter on a vacation at a luxury hotel. He joked, "Why don't you take a walk by the cliff? Maybe you'll meet the old lady again." I just walked away silently. He fainted when he saw the surprise I had prepared. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this and comment the city you're watching from. My name is Donald, and 6 months ago, I buried the love of my life. Joyce and I had 42 years together, and I thought I knew what grief looked like. I was wrong. Grief isn't just the aching emptiness when you reach for someone who isn't there anymore. It's watching your own daughter slip away from you while her husband circles like a vulture, waiting for the right moment to strike. The hotel in the Blue Ridge Mountains was Joyce's favorite place. We'd come here every October for the past 15 years, watching the leaves turn gold and crimson while we planned our future together. Now I was back, but instead of my beloved wife beside me, I had my 34-year-old daughter Joan and her husband Joshua. I'd hoped this trip might help us reconnect, maybe find some semblance of the family we used to be before Joyce's sudden heart attack turned our world upside down. But Joshua had changed since the funeral. The charming, attentive son-in-law who used to call me Dad and ask about my woodworking projects now barely looked at me. During the 2-hour drive up here, he'd spent most of the time on his phone, talking in hushed tones about timelines and legal procedures. When Joan tried to include me in conversation, he'd interrupt with some urgent business matter that apparently couldn't wait. I should have seen it coming. The signs were all there in the weeks following Joyce's death. The way Joshua's eyes would light up whenever the lawyer mentioned estate planning, how he'd suddenly become very interested in my retirement accounts and insurance policies, the subtle suggestions that maybe I was too overwhelmed to handle financial decisions on my own. We'd checked into our adjoining rooms at the Mountain View Lodge around 4 in the afternoon, the same rooms Joyce and I always requested, with the large balcony overlooking the valley. I stood there for a long moment, remembering how she'd wrap herself in that old blue sweater and point out different peaks in the distance, making up stories about the people who might live there. "Dad, are you okay?" Joan's voice broke through my reverie. She was standing in the doorway between our rooms, her face etched with concern. She looked so much like her mother at that age, the same dark hair, the same gentle brown eyes. But there was something different now, a tension around her mouth that hadn't been there before. "Just thinking about your mother," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She loved this view. Joshua appeared behind her, already changed into expensive hiking clothes that looked like they'd never seen an actual trail. "Yeah, well, we can't live in the past forever," he said, checking his phone again. "Joan, we should get going if we want to catch the sunset at Eagles Point." I'd planned to suggest we all go together, maybe share some stories about Joyce along the way. But before I could speak, Joshua was already ushering Joan toward the door. "You don't mind if we go ahead, do you, Donald?" he said, using my first name in that casual way that somehow felt like a small slap. "The hike might be a bit much for someone your age." Joan shot him a look, but didn't contradict him. That stung more than I cared to admit. My daughter, who used to beg me to take her hiking when she was young, now saw me as too frail for a simple walk. "Of course," I said. "You two go ahead. I'll just rest here for a bit." After they left, I sat on the balcony and watched the shadows lengthen across the valley. The silence felt heavier than it should have. Joyce always said this place had a magical quality, that it could heal whatever was troubling your heart. But sitting there alone, I felt more broken than ever. They returned just after dark, Joan chattering excitedly about the views while Joshua checked his phone for messages. We went down to the dining room for dinner, and I tried to engage them in conversation about the old days, about family traditions we might want to continue. But Joshua kept steering the conversation toward practical matters. "Have you given any more thought to that retirement community Joan and I looked at?" he asked, cutting into his steak with surgical precision. "The one with the full medical facilities? I'm not ready for that kind of change," I said carefully. Joyce and I had looked at that same place years ago and decided we wanted to stay in our own home as long as possible. "But Dad, you're all alone in that big house now," Joan said gently, "and you've seemed so tired lately, so forgetful." Forgetful. That was Joshua's word. He'd been planting that seed for weeks, pointing out every minor mistake I made, every moment of distraction. The way he said it made it sound like I was already halfway to dementia. "I'm grieving, sweetheart," I said. "That's different from being mentally incompetent." Joshua's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "No one said anything about incompetent. We're just concerned about your well-being." The next morning, I woke early and decided to take a walk on the mountain trail behind the hotel. The path wound through dense forest before opening onto a rocky outcrop with a spectacular view of the valley below. There was a wooden safety rail along the edge, but beyond that, the cliff dropped away into empty air. I was standing there, thinking about Joyce and how much she would have loved the morning light on the mountains, when I heard footsteps behind me. Joan and Joshua emerged from the tree line, both breathing hard from the climb. "Dad, there you are," Joan said. "We were worried when we couldn't find you." Joshua walked over to the edge, peering down at the 100-foot drop. A strange smile played at the corners of his mouth. "Quite a view," he said. Then he turned to me with that same smile. "You know, Donald, why don't you take a walk closer to the edge? Maybe you'll run into the old lady down there." The words hit me like a physical blow. Joan gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Joshua, what's wrong with you?" But he just shrugged, still smiling that cold, calculating smile. "What? I'm just saying maybe Donald misses his wife so much he'd like to join her." I felt something inside me break and reform into something harder, the casual cruelty, the complete disregard for my grief, the suggestion that I should throw myself off a cliff. It all crystallized into a moment of perfect clarity. I didn't say anything. I couldn't trust myself to speak without saying something I might regret. Instead, I turned and walked back down the trail, leaving them both standing there. Behind me, I could hear Joan's voice, sharp with anger, but I couldn't make out the words. Back in my room, I sat on the bed and stared at my hands. They were steady now, steadier than they'd been in months. Joshua had just shown me exactly who he was, and more importantly, he'd shown me what I needed to do about it. The drive back from the mountains was silent. Joan sat in the passenger seat, occasionally glancing back at me with worried eyes, while Joshua gripped the steering wheel and stared straight ahead. His casual cruelty at the cliff had shaken something loose in Joan, and I could see her beginning to question things she'd previously accepted without thought. But I was already thinking 8 years back to when Joshua first appeared in our lives. Joan had just finished her master's degree in social work and was starting her first job at the County Children's Services Office. She met Joshua at a professional networking event where he introduced himself as a financial consultant specializing in estate planning for families in crisis. Even then, I should have paid closer attention to how quickly he'd zeroed in on our family's situation. Within the first month of dating Joan, he knew that Joyce and I owned our home outright, had substantial retirement savings, and that Joan was our only child. He asked questions that seemed caring, but were actually quite calculating. How was my health? Did we have long-term care insurance? Had we updated our wills recently? Joyce had been charmed by him initially. "He's so practical," she'd said after one of their first dinners together. "Joan needs someone who can help her think about the future." But I remembered now how Joshua's interest in our daughter seemed to intensify after he learned about my successful contracting business and the life insurance policies Joyce and I carried. The courtship had been swift and strategic. Within 6 months, he was practically living at Joan's apartment. Within a year, he'd proposed with a ring that cost more than most people's cars. When I asked him how he could afford it on a financial consultant's salary, he'd laughed and said he believed in investing in the things that mattered most. The wedding had been elaborate, far beyond what Joan had ever dreamed of. Joshua insisted on paying for most of it, claiming he wanted to give Joan the fairy tale she deserved. But I noticed he'd been very interested in the gift amounts from our side of the family, keeping detailed notes about who gave what. At the time, I thought he was just being thorough about thank you notes. Now, sitting in my kitchen 3 days after our disastrous mountain trip, I was going through Joyce's old journals. She'd kept them faithfully for decades, writing down her thoughts about daily life, family events, and anything that troubled her. I'd avoided reading them since her death, afraid they'd make the grief too sharp to bear. But Joshua's comment about the cliff had awakened something in me that demanded answers. What I found in those final entries made my blood run cold. March 15th, Joshua stopped by today while Joan was at work. Said he wanted to check on me since I've been having those dizzy spells. Kept asking about my medications, wanted to see all the bottles, said he might be able to help organize them better. Strange that he's so interested in my health when Joan seems to think it's not serious. March 22nd. Joshua here again. This time he brought coffee and those pastries I like from downtown. We talked about Donald's retirement plans. He seemed very curious about exactly how much money we have saved up. Asked if we'd considered converting some investments to make them more accessible for emergencies. I told him Donald handles all that, but he said maybe I should be more involved, just in case something happened to Donald first. April 2nd, had coffee with Martha next door. She mentioned seeing Joshua's car here several times when both Joan and Donald were at work. I didn't realize he'd been visiting so often. When I asked Joan about it, she seemed surprised. Joshua told her he'd only stopped by twice. Why would he lie about something so small? April 10th. Something's bothering me about Joshua's questions. Today he asked about our life insurance policies again. Wanted to know if Joan was the beneficiary on everything. When I said some policies had different arrangements, he got very quiet. Then he started talking about how hard it would be for Joan to handle everything if something happened to both Donald and me. Said she might need help from someone who understood financial matters. My hands were shaking as I read the last entry, dated just 3 days before Joyce's fatal heart attack. April 18th. Joshua brought lunch today. Asked again about my medication schedule. Offered to set up one of those pill organizer systems for me. Said Joan was worried I might forget doses. But I haven't been forgetting. I've been taking the same medications for 3 years. Why would I suddenly start forgetting now? And why is he so concerned about pills Joan never even mentioned? I set the journal down and walked to the window, looking out at the garden Joyce had loved so much. The woman who wrote those entries wasn't confused or paranoid. She was observant and intelligent, and she'd noticed something that made her uncomfortable. The fact that she'd died just days after that last entry couldn't be a coincidence. I thought about all the times in recent months when Joshua had made subtle comments about my mental state, how he'd started pointing out small memory lapses that I'd never experienced before Joyce's death, how he'd begun suggesting that grief might be affecting my judgment, that maybe I shouldn't be making important decisions alone. The pattern was becoming clear. Joshua hadn't just married Joan for love, he'd married into our family with a specific plan in mind. First, establish himself as the helpful, caring son-in-law. Then, systematically undermine both Joyce and me, making us seem unreliable while positioning himself as the responsible one. Finally, inherit everything when we were gone, with Joan too emotionally dependent on him to question his motives. But something had gone wrong with his timeline. Joyce's sudden death had been unexpected, and now I was still alive, still asking questions, still able to interfere with his plans. That's why he'd been pushing so hard for me to move to a retirement facility. That's why he kept bringing up my supposed memory problems. And that's why he'd made that cruel comment about joining Joyce at the bottom of the cliff. I picked up my phone and dialed my lawyer's number. Margaret Patterson had handled our family's legal affairs for over 20 years, and she'd known Joyce and me since before Joan was born. "Donald," she said warmly when she heard my voice, "how are you holding up?" "I need to see you," I said. "Today, if possible. And Margaret, I need you to keep this conversation completely confidential. Can we meet somewhere other than your office?" There was a pause. "Of course. Is everything all right?" "No," I said, looking down at Joyce's journal still open on the table. "I don't think it is, but I'm going to fix it." That afternoon I sat across from Margaret at a small cafe downtown, far from any place Joshua might see us. I showed her Joyce's journal entries and explained my growing suspicions about my son-in-law's motives. Margaret listened carefully, occasionally asking questions about specific incidents. When I finished, She sat back in her chair and studied my face. "Donald, these are very serious concerns," she said. "If you're right about Joshua's intentions, then Joan could be in real danger, financially and possibly otherwise." "What can we do?" I asked. She was quiet for a long moment. "Well, we could start by making some changes to your estate planning. Make sure that even if something happened to you, Joshua couldn't get his hands on the money you've set aside for Joan's future." "What did you have in mind?" Margaret smiled, and for the first time in months, I felt like I might actually be able to protect my daughter from the predators she'd married. "Let's discuss creating a trust," she said. "One with very specific conditions that Joshua would find quite unpleasant." 2 weeks after meeting with Margaret, I was sitting in my den, going through the trust documents she'd prepared when my phone rang. It was Joan, and she sounded upset. "Dad, Joshua and I had a fight," she said, her voice thick with tears. "He's been acting so strange lately, and after what happened at the mountain, I just can't shake the feeling that something's wrong." "What kind of fight?" I asked, setting the papers aside. "He's been pressuring me to talk to you about selling the house. Says it's too much for you to maintain, that you'd be happier somewhere with more support. But Dad, you love that house. You and Mom built your whole life there." I felt a familiar anger rising in my chest. Joshua was escalating his timeline, probably because he sensed that Joan was starting to question his motives. "What did you tell him?" "I said it wasn't our decision to make, that you're perfectly capable of deciding where you want to live." He got really angry, said I was being naive about your condition. She paused. "Dad? What condition?" "You seem fine to me. Sad, obviously, but not sick or confused." "I'm not sick, sweetheart. I'm grieving your mother, but my mind is as sharp as it's ever been." "That's what I thought." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Dad, I think Joshua's been lying to me about a lot of things." Before I could respond, I heard Joshua's voice in the background, and Joan quickly said she had to go. But something in her tone told me that she was finally starting to see her husband clearly. That evening, I decided to drive over to their house. I told myself I just wanted to check on Joan, but truthfully, I was hoping to catch Joshua off guard, maybe learn something about his real plans. They lived in an upscale subdivision, about 20 minutes from my place, in a house that had always seemed too expensive for their combined income. I parked across the street and was walking up to the front door when I heard Joshua's voice coming from the backyard. He was on his phone, pacing back and forth on their deck, and his tone was urgent, almost desperate. "Look, I know what we discussed, but the timeline has changed," he was saying. "The old man is more alert than we anticipated, and Joan is starting to ask questions." I froze, pressing myself against the side of the house where I could hear, but couldn't be seen. "No, he's not moving to the facility yet. Joan shut that down completely after our trip." Joshua's voice was getting more agitated. "She's being sentimental about him staying in that house." There was a pause, and then Joshua laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. "Trust me, I tried the direct approach, suggested he might want to join his wife permanently, if you know what I mean. But that just made Joan suspicious." My blood turned to ice. He'd just admitted that his comment about the cliff wasn't a thoughtless joke. It had been a calculated suggestion that I should kill myself. "Look, we need to move faster on this," Joshua continued. "Can you expedite the competency evaluation? Maybe find some grounds to have him declared mentally unfit? Because if we don't get control of his assets soon, I'm going to be in serious trouble financially." Competency evaluation, the pieces were falling into place now. Joshua had been building a case that I was mentally declining, probably planning to have me declared incompetent so he could gain control of my finances through Joan. "I don't care what it costs," Joshua was saying. "I've got creditors breathing down my neck, and that investment we made in the crypto market went south faster than we expected. If I don't get access to some serious money soon, I'm looking at bankruptcy." Crypto market. So that's where Joshua's money had gone. All those expensive clothes, the elaborate wedding, the house they couldn't really afford. It had all been financed by risky investments that had failed. "Yes, I understand the risks," Joshua said, "but we're talking about at least $800,000 in retirement accounts, plus the life insurance money from the wife, plus whatever the house sells for. That's well over $1 million, even after the trust takes its cut." "Trust? What trust?" Joyce and I had never set up any kind of trust. Unless, right, the trust that was supposedly set up for Joan when she was born. The wife mentioned it a few times before she died. Something about college funds that turned into a long-term investment. Joan doesn't even know about it, which works in our favor. I felt sick. Joyce had mentioned that old college fund to Joshua, probably in one of their conversations when he was visiting her while Joan and I were at work. There was no trust. That money had been rolled into other investments years ago, but Joshua didn't know that. "Look, I need you to find a way to make this happen quickly," Joshua said. "The old man is starting to suspect something." Yesterday, Joan told me he asked her about my visits to see her mother. If he starts digging around asking questions about the timeline of her death, Joshua's voice trailed off, and I heard him walking closer to where I was hiding. I held my breath, pressing myself flatter against the house. No, I was careful about that. No evidence, no trail. Just an unfortunate acceleration of her existing heart condition. But if anyone starts looking too closely at the medication schedule, or asking why I was there so often in those final weeks, my worst fears were confirmed. Joshua hadn't just wished for Joyce's death, he'd caused it. Somehow he'd manipulated her medications or condition to trigger the heart attack that killed her. "I have to go," Joshua said suddenly. Joan's car just pulled into the driveway. "Remember, we need that evaluation scheduled within the next 2 weeks. And make sure the doctor understands what's at stake here." I heard footsteps moving away, and then the sound of a sliding door closing. A moment later, Joan's voice called out from the front of the house. "Joshua, where are you? I brought dinner from that Chinese place you like." I waited until I was sure Joshua was inside before carefully making my way back to my car. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition, but somehow I managed to drive home without attracting attention. Back in my den, I sat in Joyce's favorite chair and tried to process what I'd learned. Joshua had killed my wife. He was planning to have me declared mentally incompetent. And he was conspiring with someone, probably a corrupt doctor or lawyer, to steal everything Joyce and I had worked for our entire lives. But now I had something I hadn't had before. Concrete evidence of his plans. I picked up my phone and called Margaret's emergency number. "Margaret, it's Donald. I need to see you first thing tomorrow morning. And I need you to contact someone at the district attorney's office. I think I'm going to need their help." "Donald, what's happened?" I looked down at Joyce's journal still sitting on the table where I'd left it. "I just learned that my son-in-law murdered my wife, and now he's planning to finish what he started." The next morning I woke up with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt since Joyce's death. Joshua thought he was playing chess with a grief-stricken old man who couldn't see more than one move ahead. He had no idea that I'd been watching, listening, and planning. But before I could make my next move, I needed to protect Joan. Because if Joshua was willing to kill Joyce to get what he wanted, there was no telling what he might do to our daughter if he felt cornered. I reached for my phone to call Margaret, but it rang before I could dial. The caller ID showed Joan's number. "Dad," she said, and I could hear tears in her voice. "Something terrible has happened." "Dad, I need to see you right away," Joan said through her tears. "Can I come over? I can't talk about this on the phone." 20 minutes later, she was sitting on my couch, clutching a tissue, and looking more fragile than I'd seen her since she was a child. Her usually perfect hair was disheveled, and there were dark circles under her eyes that told me she hadn't slept. "Joan, what's wrong?" I asked, though part of me was terrified to hear the answer. "It's Joshua," she said, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "Dad, I think he's been lying to me about everything. Our finances, his job, maybe even about Mom." My heart started racing, but I kept my expression calm. "What makes you say that?" "Last night, after I got home with dinner, I found some papers in his office that he'd left out. Financial documents, Dad? We're broke. Worse than broke. We owe over $200,000 on credit cards alone, and there are notices from banks about missed loan payments." She pulled a crumpled envelope from her purse. "This came in yesterday's mail. It's from his company, Dad. He's been fired for 3 months. He's been leaving every morning, pretending to go to work, but he hasn't had a job since before Mom died." I felt my anger building, but I forced myself to speak gently. "Did you confront him about it?" "I tried to, but he got so angry, Dad. Angrier than I've ever seen him. He started yelling about how I didn't understand the pressure he was under, how he was trying to protect me from the truth. Then he said something that really scared me. Joan's voice dropped to a whisper. He said that once you were properly situated, those were his exact words, everything would work out, that we just had to be patient a little longer. When I asked what he meant, he said you needed professional care and that it wasn't fair to burden me with making that decision. The manipulation was even worse than I'd imagined. Joshua was setting Joan up to feel guilty about my supposed need for care, making her think that putting me in a facility would be an act of kindness rather than financial opportunism. "Sweetheart," I said carefully, "has Joshua ever talked to you about my mental state, suggested that I might be confused or forgetful?" Joan nodded miserably. "All the time, especially since Mom died. He keeps pointing out little things, like if you repeat a story or forget someone's name. He says grief can sometimes trigger early dementia in people your age. But Dad, you don't seem confused to me. You seem sad, which is completely normal." "I am sad," I said, "but I'm not confused. And Joan, I need you to understand something important. Joshua has been manipulating both of us." Over the next hour, I told her everything. About the journal entries I'd found, about the overheard phone conversation, about my growing suspicions regarding her mother's death. I watched her face go through a range of emotions: disbelief, horror, and finally a cold fury that reminded me of Joyce when someone threatened our family. "He killed Mom?" she whispered. "I believe so. And I think he's been planning to eliminate me too, one way or another." Joan was quiet for a long time, staring down at her hands. When she finally looked up, her eyes were dry and determined. "What do we do?" "We're going to stop him," I said, "but we have to be very careful. If Joshua realizes we know what he's done, he might become desperate enough to try something drastic." "Like what?" I thought about his comment at the cliff, about his suggestion that I should join Joyce permanently. "I don't want to find out." Right. That afternoon, while Joan went home to act normal and keep Joshua from suspecting anything, I met with Margaret and Detective Sarah Chen from the district attorney's office. Detective Chen was a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who specialized in financial crimes and elder abuse. "The problem," Detective Chen explained after I'd told her everything, "is that most of what you've described is circumstantial. The overheard phone conversation would be inadmissible in court, and the journal entries, while suggestive, don't prove murder." "So what can we do?" I asked. Margaret leaned forward. "We can protect your assets and set a trap. The trust we've been working on will make it impossible for Joshua to inherit anything, even if something happens to you. But more importantly, we can use his greed against him." "How?" "You're going to play along with his plan," Detective Chen said. "Let him think he's winning, agree to the competency evaluation, act confused and vulnerable. Meanwhile, we'll be documenting everything he does and says." "You want me to pretend to be senile?" "We want you to give Joshua enough rope to hang himself," Margaret said, "because right now, he thinks he's the smartest person in the room. But he's about to find out that underestimating a grieving father was the biggest mistake of his life." The next few days were the hardest of my life since Joyce's funeral. I had to pretend that nothing had changed, that I was still the confused, manipulable old man Joshua believed me to be. When he suggested I might benefit from a professional evaluation of my mental state, I agreed with apparent reluctance. When he brought over brochures for upscale retirement facilities, I looked at them with feigned interest. But the worst part was watching Joan. She had to go home every night to a man who had murdered her mother and was planning to destroy her father. She had to smile at him, cook dinner for him, sleep in the same bed with him, all while knowing what kind of monster he really was. The competency evaluation was scheduled for the following Wednesday. Joshua had arranged for it to be conducted by Dr. Richard Fleming, a neurologist who apparently owed Joshua some kind of favor. But what Joshua didn't know was that Detective Chen had already spoken with Dr. Fleming, and the good doctor was now very interested in cooperating with law enforcement. This Dr. Fleming has been under investigation for insurance fraud, Detective Chen explained during one of our secret meetings. When we approached him about Joshua's request, He was more than happy to help us build a case in exchange for consideration on his own charges. So he's going to declare me competent? He's going to do better than that. He's going to document Joshua's attempts to influence the evaluation, and he's going to record everything Joshua says during the appointment. The night before the evaluation, Joan called me with an update that made my blood run cold. "Dad, Joshua's been on the phone with someone most of the evening. I couldn't hear everything, but I caught parts of it. He was talking about accelerating something, and he mentioned life insurance policies. Then he said something about not being able to wait much longer for a natural solution. Natural solution. The implication was clear. If the competency evaluation didn't give Joshua what he wanted quickly enough, he was prepared to take more direct action. "Joan, I want you to pack a bag tonight and bring it to work tomorrow. Don't come home after the evaluation. Come straight to my house instead." "Dad, what if he gets suspicious?" "Sweetheart, we're past worrying about that. This is going to end tomorrow, one way or another." That night I sat in my den looking at a photograph of Joyce on our wedding day. She'd been so beautiful, so full of life and hope for our future together. She'd trusted Joshua, welcomed him into our family, and he'd repaid that trust by slowly poisoning her. But tomorrow, Joyce would finally get justice, and Joshua would learn that some old men are more dangerous than they appear. I picked up my phone and sent a text to Detective Chen. "I'm ready." Her response came back immediately. "So are we. Good luck tomorrow, Donald. We're going to get him." Wednesday morning arrived gray and drizzly, which seemed fitting for what I knew would be Joshua's last day of freedom. I dressed carefully in clothes that made me look older and more frail than my 66 years. A slightly wrinkled shirt, pants that hung loose on my frame, shoes that were comfortable but worn. The performance of my life was about to begin. Joshua picked me up at 9:30, and I could see the barely contained excitement in his eyes. He thought this was the day everything would fall into place for him. Dr. Fleming's office was in a medical complex downtown, and during the 20-minute drive, Joshua kept up a steady stream of reassuring chatter. "This is just a precaution, Donald," he said, using that patronizing tone he'd perfected over the past few months. "Dr. Fleming is very understanding about the effects of grief on cognitive function. He just wants to make sure you're getting the support you need." I nodded vaguely and stared out the window, playing the part of a confused old man who didn't quite understand what was happening to him. But inside, I was completely alert and focused. Everything depended on what happened in the next few hours. Dr. Fleming's office was exactly what I'd expected. Expensive furniture, medical diplomas on the walls, and an air of professional authority that Joshua clearly found intimidating. What Joshua didn't know was that hidden cameras and recording devices had been placed throughout the room the night before. Dr. Fleming was a thin man in his 50s with prematurely gray hair and nervous eyes. When we were introduced, he shook my hand with the kind of gentle firmness that suggested he thought I might break. "Mr. Holloway, thank you for coming in today," he said. "I understand you've been through a difficult time recently." "My wife died," I said simply, letting my voice shake just a little. 6 months ago, heart attack. I'm very sorry for your loss. That must have been quite a shock." Joshua leaned forward in his chair. "It's been very hard on him, Doctor. He seemed increasingly confused since Joyce passed. Memory problems, difficulty making decisions. Yesterday he couldn't remember our neighbor's name, and he's known her for 15 years. This was a complete lie, but I just nodded along as if I couldn't quite follow the conversation. Dr. Fleming began the evaluation with standard cognitive tests, asking me to repeat number sequences, remember lists of words, and answer questions about current events. I performed slightly below average, making the kinds of mistakes that could indicate mild cognitive decline but weren't severe enough to be obvious acting. "Now, Mr. Holloway," Dr. Fleming said about halfway through the session, "I'd like to ask you some questions about your financial situation. Do you feel confident managing your money and making important financial decisions?" This was the moment Joshua had been waiting for. I could see him literally sitting on the edge of his seat. It's complicated," I said, rubbing my forehead as if I had a headache. Joyce always helped with the bills. Now I get confused about what needs to be paid when. Have you considered having someone help you with financial management? Dr. Fleming asked. Joshua has offered, I said, glancing at my son-in-law. He's very good with money matters. Joshua's eyes lit up, but he tried to look modest. I just want to make sure Donald doesn't have to worry about those kinds of details while he's grieving. It's a lot of stress for someone his age. That's very thoughtful of you, Dr. Fleming said. Then he did something that wasn't part of the standard evaluation. Mr. Calloway, would you mind stepping outside for a moment? I'd like to speak with Mr. Holloway privately. Joshua's face tightened almost imperceptibly. Is that really necessary? I mean, Donald might feel more comfortable with family present. It's standard procedure, Dr. Fleming said firmly. Just for a few minutes. Reluctantly, Joshua left the room. The moment the door closed, Dr. Fleming's entire demeanor changed. He sat forward and spoke in a clear, businesslike voice. Mr. Holloway, I need you to understand that everything we say now is being recorded. Are you comfortable with that? I straightened up in my chair, dropping the confused act entirely. Completely comfortable, Doctor. Good. Now I want you to tell me exactly what Joshua said to you about this evaluation and what he's hoping to achieve. For the next 15 minutes, I recounted every conversation I'd had with Joshua about my supposed mental decline, his suggestions about financial help, and his pressure for me to move to a care facility. Dr. Fleming took detailed notes and asked specific questions about Joshua's behavior and statements. Now, Dr. Fleming said, when I call Joshua back in, I'm going to give him exactly what he thinks he wants. I'm going to suggest that you have some cognitive impairment and recommend that someone else help manage your affairs. I want you to watch his reaction carefully. When Joshua returned, Dr. Fleming delivered his fabricated assessment with Oscar-worthy performance. I'm afraid Mr. Holloway is showing signs of mild cognitive impairment, possibly early-stage dementia. While he's not incompetent, I would strongly recommend that he have assistance with complex financial decisions. Joshua tried to look concerned, but I could see the triumph in his eyes. What kind of assistance are we talking about? Ideally, someone would be given power of attorney to handle banking, investments, and major purchases. Given your relationship and your background in financial planning, you would be the logical choice. If that's what's best for Donald, Joshua said, his voice heavy with fake reluctance. I just want to make sure he's protected. Dr. Fleming nodded gravely. I'll prepare a detailed report recommending this arrangement. It should be sufficient for any legal proceedings you might need to initiate. After we left the office, Joshua was practically vibrating with excitement, though he tried to hide it behind a mask of concern. Well, Donald, that wasn't so bad, was it? Dr. Fleming seems very knowledgeable. I suppose, I said, maintaining my confused persona. What happens now? Now we make sure you get the help you need, Joshua said, and I could hear the greed in his voice. I'll talk to Joan about setting up some legal arrangements to make things easier for you. That evening, Joan came to my house as planned, carrying a small suitcase and looking terrified. Dad, Joshua was on the phone for hours after you got back from the doctor. He kept talking about timelines and accessing accounts. What happened at the evaluation? I told her everything, including how Dr. Fleming had played his part perfectly. He's going to recommend that Joshua be given power of attorney over my finances. Joshua thinks he's won. But he hasn't, has he? I smiled and walked over to my safe, pulling out the thick folder of documents Margaret had prepared. Not even close, sweetheart. Tomorrow morning, we're going to show Joshua exactly what he's actually won. Joan opened the folder and began reading. Her eyes widened as she saw the terms of the trust that had been established in her name. Dad, this is incredible. But won't Joshua fight this? He can try, I said. But he's going to have bigger problems to worry about. My phone buzzed with a text from Detective Chen. Recording devices picked up everything. Joshua made 3 calls after leaving the doctor's office, including one where he discussed accelerating the timeline for the old man's decline. We have enough to arrest him. Ishtik. I showed the message to Joan, and I watched as the last of her love for Joshua died in her eyes. She'd been holding on to hope that maybe we were wrong about him, that there was some innocent explanation for his behavior. But there was no explaining away what he'd just said to his co-conspirators. "When?" she asked quietly. "Tomorrow morning. Margaret has arranged for Joshua to come here to discuss the power of attorney paperwork. Detective Chen and her team will be waiting." Joan was quiet for a long moment, then she looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen before. A cold determination that reminded me of Joyce when someone threatened our family. "Good," she said simply. "I want to watch his face when he realizes he's lost everything." That night, I barely slept. Part of me was nervous about the confrontation to come, but mostly I felt a sense of anticipation I hadn't experienced since Joyce's death. Tomorrow, her killer would finally face justice. Tomorrow, the man who had tried to destroy our family would learn that he had picked the wrong victims. At 7 in the morning, my phone rang. It was Joshua, and his voice was bright with fake concern. "Donald, I hope you slept well. I know yesterday was difficult, but I think Dr. Fleming's recommendations are really going to help. Can I come over this morning to discuss some paperwork? I've already spoken with a lawyer about setting up the power of attorney arrangement." "What?" "Of course," I said, putting just the right amount of confusion and gratitude in my voice. "I appreciate you taking care of this, Joshua." "That's what family is for," he said, and I had to grip the phone tighter to keep from saying what I really thought about his definition of family. "I'll see you at 9, I said. "See you then, Donald, and don't worry about anything. After today, all your troubles will be over." He was right about that, just not in the way he imagined. Thursday morning arrived crisp and clear, as if the weather itself knew that justice was finally coming. I sat in my kitchen, drinking coffee and watching Detective Chen's unmarked car pull into position across the street. 2 other vehicles had already taken up strategic positions around the neighborhood, their occupants invisible but ready. Joan had spent the night in the guest room, and she came down at 8:30, dressed for work, but carrying the weight of what we were about to do. Her face was pale but determined. "Are you ready for this, sweetheart?" I asked. She nodded, then surprised me by reaching over and squeezing my hand. "Dad, I need you to know how sorry I am. I should have seen what he was doing. I should have protected you and Mom." "You have nothing to apologize for," I said firmly. "Joshua is a predator, and predators are experts at hiding their true nature. Even your mother didn't realize what he was until it was too late." Well, at exactly 9 o'clock, Joshua's car pulled into my driveway. Through the window, I could see him gathering a briefcase and a folder of papers, no doubt filled with documents that would transfer control of my life savings into his hands. He looked confident, almost cheerful, as he walked up the front steps. I opened the door before he could knock, maintaining my performance as the confused, vulnerable old man he thought he was manipulating. "Joshua, good morning. Come in, come in." "Morning, Donald. Beautiful day, isn't it?" He stepped inside, his eyes already scanning the room as if he were calculating the value of my possessions. "I brought all the paperwork we discussed. This shouldn't take long." We sat down at my dining room table, the same table where Joyce and I had shared thousands of meals, where we'd helped Joan with her homework, where we'd planned our retirement together. It felt fitting that this was where Joshua's schemes would finally come to an end. "Now then," Joshua said, opening his briefcase with the enthusiasm of a man about to inherit a fortune, "I've had my lawyer prepare all the necessary documents. The power of attorney agreement, some paperwork to transfer your accounts to my management, and authorization for me to handle the sale of this house when you're ready to move to a care facility." I blinked at him with feigned confusion. "Sale of the house? But I thought I was just getting help with the bills." Joshua's smile was patronizing and completely false. "Donald, we talked about this. Dr. Fleming was very clear that you need more comprehensive care. The house is too much for you to maintain, and the equity would pay for a very nice assisted living arrangement." "How much equity?" I asked, playing the part of a man who couldn't quite grasp financial concepts anymore. "Well, the house is worth approximately $450,000, and you own it outright. That, combined with your retirement accounts and life insurance from Joyce, gives us quite a bit to work with." Joshua's eyes gleamed as he spoke about our money. "And Joan agrees with this plan?" Joshua's expression flickered for just a moment. "Joan understands that this is what's best for you. She's been very worried about your condition." That was when Joan walked into the dining room, and Joshua's face went white. He clearly hadn't expected her to be here, and her presence threw off whatever script he'd prepared. "Actually, Joshua," Joan said, her voice ice cold, "I've been worried about a lot of things lately. But Dad's condition isn't one of them." Joshua recovered quickly, switching to his concerned husband persona. "Joan, honey, what are you doing here? Shouldn't you be at work?" "I took the day off. I thought I should be here when Dad signs these important papers." She sat down across from him, and I could see Joshua growing increasingly uncomfortable. That's thoughtful of you," he said, but his confidence was wavering. I picked up the first document and pretended to read it carefully. "This gives you control over my bank accounts? Just to help you manage them, Donald. You won't have to worry about paying bills or making investment decisions anymore." "And this one?" I held up another paper. "That authorizes me to sell the house when the time comes, but only when you're ready, of course." "When I'm ready? Or when you decide I'm ready?" Something in my tone must have alerted him, because Joshua's smile became strained. "Donald, I'm only trying to help. Dr. Fleming said you need assistance with these kinds of decisions." "Yes, about Dr. Fleming," I said, setting the papers down and looking directly at Joshua. "It's interesting how quickly you found a doctor who was willing to declare me incompetent." "Not incompetent," Joshua said quickly, "just in need of support." "Support," I repeated, "like the support you gave Joyce in her final weeks." The change in Joshua was immediate and dramatic. The mask of concern slipped completely, replaced by something cold and calculating. "What's that supposed to mean?" Joan leaned forward. "It means we know what you did, Joshua. We know about the medications, about your visits when we weren't home, about everything." Joshua's eyes darted between us, and I could see him trying to figure out how much we actually knew. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I was trying to help Joyce manage her condition." "By changing her medication schedule?" I asked quietly. "By making sure she took the wrong doses at the wrong times?" For a moment, Joshua said nothing. Then he laughed, but it was a harsh, ugly sound. "You can't prove any of that. Joyce had a heart condition. She died of natural causes." "Maybe," I said. "But you know what I can prove. I can prove that you've been planning to steal my money. I can prove that you conspired with Dr. Fleming to have me declared mentally incompetent. And I can prove that you've been lying about everything, including your job." Joshua's face flushed red. "You senile old fool. You have no idea what you're talking about." "Don't I?" I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a small recording device. "This has been recording our entire conversation, Joshua, including the part where you admitted that Dr. Fleming was willing to declare me incompetent." The color drained from Joshua's face. You can't do that. That's illegal." "Actually, it's not. This is my house, and I have every right to record conversations here, especially when someone is trying to defraud me." Joshua stood up abruptly, grabbing for his briefcase. "I'm leaving. This is insane." "No," said a new voice from the kitchen doorway. "You're not." Detective Chen stepped into the dining room, followed by 2 uniformed officers. Joshua froze, his face cycling through confusion, anger, and finally, fear. "Joshua Calloway," Detective Chen said, "you're under arrest for elder abuse, conspiracy to commit fraud, and suspicion of murder in the death of Joyce Holloway." "But murder?" Joshua's voice cracked. "You can't prove murder. She died of a heart attack." "We'll see about that," Detective Chen said, as one of the officers moved to handcuff Joshua. "We have recordings of you discussing your visits to Joyce in her final weeks, and we have expert testimony about how easily heart medications can be manipulated to cause fatal arrhythmias." As the handcuffs clicked into place, Joshua turned to look at me with pure hatred. "You think you've won, old man? Even if you can't prove murder, you'll never be able to prove I did anything wrong with Joyce's medications. And without that, all you have is some financial scheme that any good lawyer can get reduced to a misdemeanor." I smiled at him, and for the first time in months, it felt genuine. "You're absolutely right, Joshua. Without proof about Joyce's medications, the murder charge might not stick." His expression shifted to confusion. "Then what?" "But you see," I continued, "Joyce wasn't the only one keeping a journal. I've been documenting every conversation we've had, every visit you've made, every lie you've told. And yesterday, While you thought you were manipulating Dr. Fleming, he was recording everything you said about your plans for me." Joshua's face went ashen. "What plans? You talked about accelerating the timeline for my decline. You discussed accessing my accounts and selling my house. And you mentioned that you couldn't wait much longer for a natural solution to your financial problems." I paused, letting that sink in. "That sounds like conspiracy to commit murder to me." Detective Chen nodded. "We have hours of recorded conversations, Mr. Calloway, including your discussion with Dr. Fleming about falsifying cognitive evaluations, and your phone calls with your accomplices about eliminating Mr. Holloway." As they led Joshua away, he kept looking back at me with disbelief. He'd thought he was the predator, but he'd never realized he was walking into a trap. After the police cars left, Joan and I sat in the quiet kitchen, both of us emotionally drained, but relieved. "Is it really over?" she asked. "The criminal case is just beginning," I said. "But yes, sweetheart, the immediate threat is over. Joshua will never hurt either of us again." Joan was quiet for a long moment. "Dad, about the trust and the will changes." I smiled. "Don't worry about that. The trust I set up protects your inheritance, but it doesn't punish you for Joshua's crimes. When you turn 40, you'll have access to everything your mother and I saved for your future. The only condition is that you have to be divorced from Joshua first." "That won't be a problem," she said with a bitter laugh. "I filed the paperwork yesterday." 2 months later, I was sitting in the same courtroom where Joshua was being sentenced. The evidence against him had been overwhelming. The recordings, the financial documents, the testimony from Dr. Fleming about Joshua's attempts to bribe him. It all painted a picture of a man who had systematically planned to destroy my family for financial gain. The murder charges related to Joyce's death had been harder to prove, but the prosecution had built a compelling case around the medication tampering and Joshua's pattern of behavior. More importantly, they discovered that Joyce wasn't his first victim. 2 previous girlfriends had died under suspicious circumstances, both after making Joshua a beneficiary of their life insurance policies. The judge sentenced Joshua to 25 years to life for murder in the first degree, plus additional time for fraud and elder abuse. As they led him away in shackles, he looked at me one last time. But instead of hatred, I saw something else in his eyes: defeat. Joan and I walked out of the courthouse together into bright spring sunshine. She'd taken a leave of absence from work to deal with the trial, but she was planning to go back the following week. The house felt empty without Joyce, but it no longer felt haunted by Joshua's presence. "Dad," Joan said as we got into my car, "I've been thinking about something." "What's that?" "Mom's journal. In those last entries, she was figuring out what Joshua was doing. She was trying to protect us even when she was sick." I nodded. "Your mother was always the smartest person in any room. If she'd lived another week, she probably would have exposed Joshua herself." "I think she did," Joan said quietly. "I think she left those journal entries knowing that eventually you'd find them and understand what they meant. She protected us even after she was gone." That evening, I sat on the back porch with a glass of Joyce's favorite wine, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. The house was quiet, but it was a peaceful quiet now, not the oppressive silence of grief and fear. My phone buzzed with a text from Detective Chen. Joshua's lawyer called. "He wants to discuss a plea deal for information about his other victims. Looks like your case is going to help a lot of other families get justice too." I smiled and typed back, "Joyce would have liked that." 6 months later, I was standing in the same spot where Joshua had made his cruel joke about joining Joyce at the bottom of the cliff. But this time, I wasn't alone. Joan was with me, along with her new boyfriend David, a kind man who worked at the children's hospital and treated her with the respect and love she deserved. "It's beautiful up here," David said, looking out over the valley. "It was always Joyce's favorite view," I said. She said it reminded her that no matter how bad things got, there was always something beautiful to look forward to. Joan slipped her arm through mine. "She was right, wasn't she?" I thought about everything that had happened. The grief, the betrayal, the fear, and finally, the justice. Joyce was gone, and I would always miss her. But Joshua's attempt to destroy our family had ultimately made Joan and me closer than we'd ever been before. "Yes, sweetheart," I said, watching the sun set behind the mountains. She was right about everything.